So I'm Wynter Douglas. I use they, them pronouns, and I currently work as a Latin high school teacher at a private school in Pennsylvania. And my main academic interests center around slavery in terms of the body under imprisonment and the body under enslavement, as well as skilled slaves within the library system of ancient Rome in the 1st century CE. And yeah, I'm also a master's student for library and information sciences, and I'm doing that online, so I can do it around my job schedule. And I applied to PhD PhD
programs.
Thank you. And I will be there next fall, but we will see if I get in. Yeah, that is me. I do because, and I've had a strange relationship with identity in terms of the term disabled, because before, like growing up, I always knew that I had at least one learning disability, and that was dyslexia. And as I grew older, I learned like, oh, I have more. But the main one that makes me consider myself disabled, and this is a horrible reason, but just because I am protected under the law because of it, is my PTSD, and I have a service animal because of that specific condition. So I consider myself legally disabled, but I'm like able-bodied for the most part. So yeah.
Yeah. What has your experience been as a student in classics? What worked? What hasn't? What's been discriminatory?
Yeah. So, like I prefaced earlier, I always knew I had dyslexia. So as a young kid, I was able to go and have like training where I was taught how to read and write and how to pronounce things. But I still sometimes have a stutter. I still speak with like a lisp of sort, I've been told. And yeah, so that's how dyslexia affects my life. But I have been able to come up with strategies to be able to work around my reading and writing difficulty from a young age. So at this point, I can write and read as well as anyone else. Sometimes it just takes longer. And for all of my life, I had undiagnosed ADHD that I only learned about my last year of college, and as well as dyscalculia, which is a learning disability around math and numbers, which doesn't affect my life at all because that is not anything. I have avoided numbers and it turns out, so it doesn't really affect me because I can just do math on calculators. But for my ADHD, it shows up in like, I like to move a lot when I talk, so that's the stereotype there. And I do have a hard time focusing, and I have extreme difficulty with executive functioning. And also something that learning disabilities can come with that's, well, we can get into this later, but I'll get into it now, is something that both dyslexia and ADHD can come with is auditory processing disorder. So it's not a physical impairment with my ears, but sometimes it takes my brain longer to process what's being said. So that has affected me within the classroom. And of course, with all of these learning disabilities, it makes it more difficult to learn, and especially languages. So learning ancient Greek, it was something I always wanted to do ever since I was a kid, learning about mythology. So I was really motivated to learn no matter what challenges I had. So, and I had the most wonderful ancient Greek teacher for intro, and I used Hansen and Quinn, which is a hard textbook, but has a lot of repetition, so that was able to help me really get the grammar and really like understand what was going on. So I would wake up 3 hours before the 8 a.m. class every day, and go into the building where it was and just study every day. And like I would be studying at night too, but I wanted to like refresh everything before class, because like even with all that extra work, I would still only be like on the lower end of the class. Like the results weren't as good as like someone without learning disabilities. And the people in that class were amazing and I love them, but they were geniuses. Um, so like it was very emotionally taxing to like do all this work, and then like after the first semester have the teacher come up to me and be like, hey, so maybe you shouldn't be in the classics with your grades. Maybe you can't do this as someone with dyslexia. And I love this teacher, but that actually kind of stung a little, because it showed how inaccessible classics could be and how people with disabilities, even simply learning disabilities, could be pushed out because your professor simply didn't believe you could do it based on like stereotypical understanding of learning disabilities. So that was one way in which I was discriminated against. But since I knew I always had dyslexia, I always was like looking at how teachers were teaching and what worked for me and what didn't work. And because I always knew I wanted to be a professor from a young age. So that was like a note: don't discourage disabled people from joining the classics if they want to and learning ancient Greek. Like they can do it. So yeah, so I was very hyper aware of teaching habits and what was ableist, what wasn't, what worked, what didn't. So because I was only, okay, but I was crying out there. She's with my sister. Since I only was officially diagnosed my senior year of college, I didn't have any accommodations before that. But I was still told my professors, oh, I have dyslexia, so this might come through with some spelling errors that I didn't catch, and please understand that. And usually that was fine. I always did take a lot longer in tests simply because it took me longer to write things out, but I was too stubborn to like go through the accommodations process. And growing up, my mom, who I lived with, didn't really, she felt that me and my siblings would be discriminated against if we had an official diagnosis. So that's why we were never officially diagnosed, despite having a learning disability that was well known. So I only went through accommodations my senior year because things were getting too hard for me to manage in terms of how my learning disabilities were affecting my classwork. And I needed accommodations to be able to even get through the courses. And we'll talk about that process later. So once I did have my accommodations, I went around telling my professors what those accommodations were. So what happens is like you get a written up letter of what you and the accommodations person agreed upon, and you hand it to your professor and you sit them down and you walk through those accommodations just so there's no confusion about what they are and what's expected. And once you have the letter, like those are your accommodations legally, they have to, or they should follow them. So when I told one of my professors what my accommodations were, he kept on saying, like for executive functioning, for example, he didn't know what that was. So I had to explain that it makes it very difficult to complete tasks in a timely manner. And he was like, oh, that's just being lazy. And like everyone does that every now and then. And I had to calmly explain to this man that is classified as a disability for a reason, and that reason is that not everyone experiences it to this degree. So he like abashedly apologized, but I think it was insincere. And after that point, a few of my professors like started acting weirder towards me, I guess, in the classroom. And I guess not really believing in my ability once they knew about my disability, which was interesting. I definitely had, I don't know where I'm going. I lost my train of thought, which also happens with ADHD.
About lack of confidence and ability once they found out about disability.
Yeah, so they didn't believe in me as much anymore. So of course that was a hit to my confidence. And I'm very much the type of person, like if you show me that you're a bad person, or if you show me that you don't believe in me, I lose respect for you. And I just don't feel the need to try like as hard to like impress you or like give you respect. So then of course that made it harder to perform in those courses where I didn't even have basic respect for these professors. Reading Greek and Latin was something that was much more difficult, just like the length of our readings, because for me, the script of Greek in particular, even though I love the language with my whole heart and it's my favorite language and I don't like Latin, just the fact that the script is different does make it harder for my eyes to track. And especially in class when I'm put on the spot and I have like anxiety as well, it makes it harder to like find the word or where we are.
Yeah.
And then like also translate in front of people is harder.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much been my experience in the classics classroom. So like I said earlier, this is something I've always been thinking of, like how I would shape my own classroom to not be like the experience I've had. And it's really, I found, made me a much more understanding teacher. And I've been able to make sure that even within my school that has set attendance policies, I've made sure that my students know that they don't have to come to class if they're sick. They don't have to come to class if they're unable to focus, or if they do come to class and can't focus, they don't have to participate. They can just take the time to do what they need to and just have the space. I've made sure that, of course, there's no technology policy in my class. That would be ridiculous. So everyone's allowed to be on their phones doing whatever they want. If they want to check messages, they can. If they want to text anyone, they can. Because if they feel the need like to check their phone, they're going to be distracted by it either way. Like they'll be thinking of like, oh dang, I got this message right before class, I don't know what it was, and then they'll be distracted. So if I let them check it in class and just like shoot off a response, then they'll be less like anxious about outside things, I found. And of course they can all use their computers. In my school district, everyone has laptops that they have, so everyone has that technology. And yeah, I don't treat the people with learning differences, as it's called in my school system, any differently from the others, unless it comes to testing where they have accommodations for more time. And of course I do that like on the down low, so like others don't know if they didn't tell them personally. So I try to make it as accessible as possible, even for those who don't need the accessibility. And I always use slides, and they always have access to the slides before and after the courses. If they're sick, I write up notes for them, like detailed notes about what we went over in class, and I give them a translation of the Latin we went over, or videos to the grammar topics we covered in case my simple explanation isn't enough. And also like articles on the story if they need it for extra context. I make sure that they have all the information they need not to fall behind, which is something that no teacher has ever done for me. And it is a lot of work, and right now I only teach 2 courses, so it's manageable. But as I continue, and like right now I'm just writing the course plan as I go. So
yeah,
continue and like do it beforehand. Like maybe when I'm a professor and know what I'm teaching, like during the summer, I can like write up all those summaries beforehand. So if anyone's sick, I can just email it off and still be able to do that, rather than when I have more workload, just abandon that accessibility. So, and I also make sure that the classroom, everyone's comfortable with each other. My first class, I asked them to write me an introductory letter. And I asked them, like, why are you in this class? Why are you taking that in? And what are you passionate about? Like, tell me your hobbies, and what do you like about classrooms, and what don't you like? What works for your learning style and what doesn't work? And is there anything else you want me to know? And then allergies, because I like to bring in snacks. Candy specifically, of course.
Okay.
And I found that all of my students were really honest with me in those letters, because I wrote them a letter as well. And I actually did disclose to them my learning disabilities specifically, because I know what it feels like to think that your professor doesn't care about how you learn or what you experience. And like what it feels like to have a professor who expects you to already know the material, especially as someone who like never had Latin before college. So that was important to me, and all the students replied in kind, and I was able to learn about their learning styles before I really started teaching. And yeah, and I found like both of my classes told me that they don't really like a quiet classroom environment. They all like to be able to speak with one another, to like not really raise their hands. And I've of course been careful to make sure that those who are more quiet and less likely to raise their hand still get an opportunity to speak. And I've even like made sure that those quiet students didn't get anxious when I randomly called on them. So that's something to also consider. So yeah, I've just really tried to connect with my students. And of course, I also let them know in my letter that I was a mandated reporter, and explained what that was. Because if you do assign a letter like this, it can, like some students may feel so comfortable that they give information that they're not ready for the ramifications of a teacher or mandated reporter knowing. So that was important that they understood that from the get-go as well. I think it is important if you feel safe doing it. And this has come up in Tara and Clara's interview as well, where they talked about how, well, they talked about how they felt a little more comfortable disclosing their disability to their students to a degree. And for me, that's definitely true. Only a few of my colleagues know I'm disabled. And of course, my old boss, because I also worked as a receptionist before teaching at the school. So I have a new boss now. Yeah, so I feel more comfortable telling my students because one, I'm in a position of power over them. So if they like choose to be ableist or discriminatory against me, what are they going to do, really? Like just hurt my feelings, like not much else. But if I tell my colleagues and then they start something, that can have like a real impact on my life. So there is more risk in disclosing to higher ups, and then I might have to deal with HR and all that when I'm not yet ready for accommodations. Because right now I do have a service dog, but she's still in training, and I don't want her to do full service work and like be with me 24/7 until she is fully grown. So she's only 9 months old now, so she's not yet fully grown. So in April, I'm going to ask HR for accommodations for her, which legally they must provide. But I do imagine that's going to be a fight because it is a no dog school. And that rule's in place because the school had a bad experience with a dog in the past. So it'll be an uphill battle. So that's why I didn't disclose my PTSD to my students or to anyone else, really. but they know about my learning disabilities for sure. I went over a little in the at the panel, and there's a slide on it. But for me, a lot of my symptoms aren't the stereotypical symptoms. Like even my panic attacks doesn't have the stereotypical signs. Like I don't really show any outward signs when I'm having a panic attack until I feel like I'm in a safe place. And I have a delayed response to stress. So even when I have panic attacks, it's not really, it won't be in front of people. So like I can be extremely negatively affected by a conversation or comments made in class. And then after the class is when all of that violence will like come crashing down on me. So that's kind of hard to navigate, as well as, and that's for my PTSD, as well as I also dissociate a lot or have depersonalization where it feels like I'm not connected, like I'm not fully present in a space. For me, it like kind of feels like I go to the back of my mind and like no one can hurt me there kind of deal, but I'm still there. Like it's like trying to move through a fog or something. It's hard to explain if you don't have that experience, but yeah, that's something that for me can be triggered very easily. And again, it's a coping mechanism or a protective measure that I had to learn. So it's not noticeable to people unless they really, really know me very well. And it's happened a lot in classics classrooms where certain topics were brought up in an indelicate manner, or there weren't any discussion guidelines. So a student said something extremely problematic that triggered a reaction in me. I've had an experience where in senior seminar, there was someone doing a thesis on a whole topic that I can't really be around if people are going to talk about. So, and this was after I got accommodations, so the professor knew to warn me about such things. One day we had presentations and I was right after her, but I didn't realize until I was already in class and she was about to start. So I was able to last maybe 2 minutes into her 15-minute presentation. And then I just like started crying, and no one noticed because like when I cry, you can't notice except like the tears. Because like I'm very good at keeping my face calm. So I had to run out of the classroom and I had a panic attack, a literal full-blown panic attack for, it was an hour-long presentation, not 15 minutes. For the full hour she was presenting, and then I had to come in and present. So it didn't go well. And afterwards I actually, right before I realized like what was going to happen, and I emailed my professor being like, I might have to leave during this presentation and here is why, and I'll try to catch up afterwards. But he didn't see that email that day, despite him always being on his little technological devices in class. So I was like, that happened, and that was,
sorry that you can hear my cat.
Yeah, it's cute. But that was something that reminded this professor of my accommodations, in terms of like, he was supposed to warn me about the content of every class beforehand. And he didn't get better at it after that. Like it happened again. But I was more prepared, so I left before my body could have that reaction. Yeah. And let's see, lesser known impacts. So another one that I didn't really get a chance to talk about during the panel is selective mutism, which is brought on, I'm not sure what of my disabilities or conditions it's brought on by, but I guess like anxiety maybe, or PTSD. With my PTSD, I also have like severe depression and anxiety as part of its symptoms. Um, but sometimes, and I don't know what triggers it, I'll just go completely mute and unable to speak. Like I'm fully conscious, I can hear everything, everything else is fine, but it just feels like my throat closed up, and no matter how much I want to, I can't speak. And that can last for hours, and I never know when it's going to stop, but you just have to wait for it to wear off. And sometimes, like, I don't know when that's going to happen. So that's another reason why I have my service dog. So if that happens, like when I'm in a seminar during my PhD, or like when I'm at work or something, she can alert someone to that, just so like it's known. And hopefully, I'm not sure if this will work. It seems to have worked. I haven't been mute in a while since I've had her, but like just her presence calms me down, and she's able to do deep pressure therapy. So basically put pressure on either my lap or my chest, and that calms me during panic attacks. And she can, I don't know what my triggers are really. I'm working through that. But so she can alert me before I'm gonna have a panic attack, which is why it's so important for me to have her around. And another symptom is being very terrified, sometimes irrationally. So having her with me, like when I have to walk outside or places where I don't feel safe or comfortable, really helps a lot. So it's great to have a service dog. She's making her way there, slowly but surely. Yeah. And for ADHD, I would say slash dyslexia, my auditory processing is something that I got accommodations for. Even though I have that, it is like that's how I learn best, by listening to things and being able to listen to it a few times. So one of my accommodations became getting text to speech software, so I could like make my course readings into, when they're in English, into podcasts for myself and just like listen to them. Because otherwise I just wouldn't ever get through my readings. And another thing I briefly talked about was the executive functioning disorder. And the way that differs from simply being lazy is that you have like such trouble starting a task that you know you're really supposed to do, and it weighs on you. Like it makes you so anxious and you feel so ashamed of it, but you just can't start it. So that's been a problem. And yeah, so in my master's program now, I have accommodations for that, as well as my anxiety, where I have 3 days past the original deadline to be able to do assignments if I need to. And that kind of like takes off some of the deadline pressure and like gives my executive functioning time to figure itself out. But that's not something I ever had at undergraduate level. And it's not something that the wonderful, very sarcastic there, accommodations officer would ever allow anyone, I think, to have. So yeah, those are some lesser known symptoms that exist within my being. So I've kind of prefaced, after going through accommodations at Bryn Mawr, where I got my BA, where you currently go to school, for the audience, my professors weren't good at following my accommodations after I got them. It really only helped me consistently with the extra time for tests. And I had like double the amount of time for tests, although even for quizzes, some professors forgot even that. I also had the accommodation to be able to leave a classroom whenever I wanted to without permission and without having to give an explanation, and just like catching up on what I missed afterwards. and I was supposed to be given like content warnings for every class. Did not happen by any professor, even though it was plainly written in my accommodations. What else? Yeah, I don't know. I can't remember if there was any other accommodations I had. Yeah. And so getting those accommodations was very difficult. I was actually in communications with the accommodations office since my first year because I knew I had dyslexia, so I went to them and I was like, I know I have dyslexia. Can I get accommodations for this? Or what is the process for that? And then they were like, oh, you have to get official accommodations and it'll cost anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000. And I was like, oh, bye. I'll just suffer, it'll be fine. And I did for 3 years. And then when I also went abroad. So when I came back from abroad, the year before I was put on the waiting list for a room. So I didn't know where I was going to live over the summer. And for me, that was extremely stressful given my home life, not knowing that I had a place to go to after the summer. Yeah. And for me, it was like so anxiety inducing that I was like having regular panic attacks. So I was able to talk to my therapist, and my therapist was like, you should go to accommodations and make sure that you can like get an early notice of where you're going to be living in a single room for other reasons as well. So I was able to, I had to have my therapist write out a letter saying like, it would be very stressful to meet with the accommodations person, that I might have a panic attack, that even if I don't look, because like my symptoms of having a panic attack are very different, that she might not be able to tell, but I'm like extremely anxious as I'm sitting there, and this was a letter for her to read to herself before our meeting. So with that letter from my therapist, very official, signed, all that, she was a lot more kind to me than she was previously and in the future from that point. And I was able to get those that housing accommodation. And when it came to get official accommodations for my learning disabilities, I ended up having to pay out of pocket $3,000, which I didn't have. So I was a Mellon Fellow, so that comes with independent research as well as a monthly stipend. And since it was my senior year, I only had so much left. So I was able to petition to the head of the Mellon coordinator at Bryn Mawr and to get all of that money to put towards funding my my learning disability testing. And that still wasn't enough. So I got all of my savings at that time and put it in. It still wasn't enough. I didn't have a lot of savings. And then so like I was freaking out and like asking people like, what should I do? So I also like reached out to Sportula, which is an organization that gives microgrants for students in need. And they were able to give me 300, which is the highest amount you can get. And it still wasn't enough. So finally I went to Bryn Mawr and I was like, I can't pay for this, but I need this. And like, here's like a petition for the Dean's Emergency Fund. And luckily they were like, yeah, you've demonstrated that you really tried your hardest to pay this, so we're just going to pay it all for you. So I was able to like give that money back to Sportula. And that's how I was able to fund it. And the process itself is extremely demoralizing and horrible because you're just being tested until you fail. You're not, like, there's no way to do good at disability testing. It just gets harder and harder until you fail. So that was very hard for my self-esteem and was very anxiety inducing. Like I cried during many of those sessions, and these are like multiple sessions that can be like 4 hours in length. And I had to go off campus for them. And so, of course, during that time, this impacted my schoolwork quite a bit. And like, I didn't have a lot of energy to perform well in my classes. And I also have a condition called PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is a horrible condition. And I was trying to figure out that. So it was around that time, and this is like now during the semester, where I was exploring medication for that. And because I hadn't previously been on medication, it was a roller coaster. My body hated it. My body does not adjust well to medication, and it takes a while. So I was like in pain and like puking my guts out and nauseous and dizzy and sensitive to light, and I had migraines. And it was just not a good time for me. And I still had to like thesis. I still had to do all my extracurriculars. I still had to come to class like nothing was going on. And of course, like my ex-Mellon mentor, was extremely horrible about this and basically yelled at me a few times and just wasn't a good person and was not understanding about my situation at all. And I was in one of his courses then, and I had a lot of like late work because I just didn't have the energy or capacity to do it at that point, and he knew exactly why, but that didn't matter to him. And it was at that point he broke FERPA with a student and complained about my health situation and my grades to another student. And because that student was my friend, of course, I heard about it, which was good. And of course, that also was extremely distressing to hear that he would say such things to someone else who, like, I could talk to about these things, but shouldn't have been brought up by a professor about me. So that was really disheartening and made me lose respect for that professor and the classics even more. So of course I didn't feel like jazzed about his class and putting in effort. And yeah, and I confronted him about that situation, and he lied to me and said he never told anyone about it, but at that point I hadn't talked to this person about what I was going through, so this person wouldn't have known any other way. So that was a situation. What even was the question? Oh yeah, so that, yeah, so that's the accommodation process. For me, I found that like my mother's fear that like having these official diagnoses will lead to discrimination did come true in a way. Knowing that I have ADHD and dyscalculia really helped me better understand myself in terms of like, oh, I'm not just a horrible person because I can't do math. It's because I actually have this learning disability that makes it harder for me to hold number facts in my mind, and I have less memory for it. And like, oh, this is why I can't focus. It's not because I've been so traumatized that I just can't, like, I'm nothing more but my trauma. It's just because like I also have ADHD, and that's different from my PTSD. And like, it helped me like compartmentalize my symptoms in a way that made me build like self-esteem and confidence in who I was more than I had before, because before I was like, what's going on? Everything's a jumble. So knowing my diagnoses helped, but having the accommodations in that setting, in that classics department, didn't really help me. Oh yeah, and another accommodation I had was to have read and write accessible PDFs for every reading, and my computer in class. So one professor one time previously didn't have like a no technology policy in his class, and then he got annoyed at people having their computers out or whatever. I was like, okay, next week don't bring in your computers. but I had accommodations for it. So I was like, I'm going to bring in my computer no matter what, because legally I have the right to. But then that put me in the situation of it being very obvious that I had accommodations to have my computer out, which isn't something that I wanted my other classmates to know, because I only had a few friends in this class, and some of the students were very judgy, to say the least.
Yeah.
And, yeah. And this professor also didn't always put PDFs that were accessible for my technology that I had accommodations for. So sometimes the reading was inaccessible to me in the format that I had accommodations for, that I basically paid or petitioned to pay $3,000 for. So it was like, accommodations didn't really help me because my professors didn't believe in them or didn't care about them enough to put in the effort to follow them. So, yeah.
Yeah. We love Bryn Mawr's accessibility office.
In every way possible. So, of course, you can't just switch it off. But because academia was such a central part of like a student's life, especially at Bryn Mawr, I risked like almost every aspect of my health to be able to go to class, to be able to do the readings and the homework and the assignments. And I was also in a number of clubs, and I had my melon research. And something that was very true for me in undergraduate and like how I managed my PTSD is I couldn't be alone with my thoughts. So I made sure that I never had a free moment ever. It was always filled with activity. So I was always exhausted. I also had sleeping issues. There was, because of my anxiety, I also, like, there was this situation with someone in the dining hall where a worker was sexually harassed me, and of course that made me uncomfortable in the dining hall. So there was a point my senior year where I almost developed an eating disorder because I was too anxious to go eat in the dining hall. So I basically had takeout for every single meal when I did eat, which was mostly like just dinner. And I have had depressive episodes where I conserved all my energy to be able to go to class. So I didn't have energy to do basic like cleanliness things. It was very hard for me to keep my room clean, everything built up, and like you couldn't see the floor by the end of senior year. It got bad. And yeah, it was just like, and of course having that environment affected my mental health, because like then I felt worthless that I wasn't even able to keep my environment clean, that I couldn't have friends over because I felt so ashamed about my room. And yeah, so it wasn't a good time to say the least. And my PMDD, before it was before I was medicated for it, and the medication I'm on does take care of, I would say, 80% of the symptoms. But before it was getting very dangerous. The main symptoms, which comes with suicidal ideation and intrusive thoughts about hurting yourself, and extreme pain, like pain so bad that you want to barf or you want to faint, and it made me dizzy, and I had headaches, and it also made it so I like couldn't sleep. But then like my depression made me want to sleep so much during the day. So before I was medicated for that, it was extremely, extremely difficult to do anything. But because of how I grew up, I was taught never to show people that. So I was very isolated and self-isolated despite doing all these things. So disability really affects people outside of the classroom in a way that impacts them within the classroom as well, is what I would say. Yeah. I would say the panel at Our Voices is the first big thing that I've done. Like you, I've also tried to have a lot of conversations with people around disability. And yeah, I did try to get the whole classics department at Bryn Mawr to do some training on trauma-informed pedagogy and teaching styles. It didn't happen, I know. I wrote a letter. I had it all set up on the side of the therapy office, and they were ready to give this training, and the English department actually wanted it as well. So it would have been but they were nice, and they actually were interested in, for the sake of students. For the classics department, I had to write a letter to the only professor who seemed to care about her students and get her to ask the department as a whole to participate in this. And of course that stalled when when my ex-mentor got a hold of it and was like, I'll lead this. And then I graduated, and of course, as is wont to happen with these 4-year institutions, once the radical people graduate, and it just doesn't happen because institutional memory is a thing that people are bad at. So that's something I tried to do that didn't really go through, but I feel like having that as a model has really informed what I'll do in my graduate program, and I'll be there for 7 years. So one of those years, or 5, 7, I don't know how many years, but one of those years, I think I can get a workshop with the therapist to teach people about trauma-informed pedagogy.
Yeah.
And once I'm a professor, I'll definitely have that happen. So, and beyond that, it's just some conversations, making sure that my friends know about my symptoms and my conditions, as well as being understanding about theirs, and trying to be there for them, and to put as less stress and pressure on them as possible. Especially I have a lot of experience with being very self-isolating, and I know how bad that can be for people's mental health. So I like to try to do get-togethers at least once a month with my friends, but I'm also very understanding if on the day or the day's approaching and they just don't have the energy, I make sure that they know that I don't think they're horrible for not being able to come, and that there'll be other opportunities. So yeah, I just try to be conscious that not everyone is able-bodied, that everyone has different experiences, and that not all disabilities are the same or experience the same. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say. Oh, don't run away. Actually, though, no.
Yeah, no, that's worthy advice, I feel like.
I would say we do need people with all these perspectives, but be careful of who you trust. Try to build community, not only of classicists and those outside of it, like you said, but also other disabled classicists. And I found that the best way to do that is through social media, unless you know people who are who have disclosed their disability and are comfortable being that wall to lean on. Because yeah, and just making sure that you have a strong support system to help you through it. And don't trust people.
I like this dichotomy. Don't trust people, but also trust a few people.
A few people, and investigate them first. And I would also say practice self-advocacy. If something isn't going the way it should, practice being able to speak up for yourself And if that means drafting an email to a professor and having your friends read it, or a professor you trust read it before you send it, that's okay. If it means practicing the speech of a conversation you're going to have with a professor about your disability beforehand with a friend, then that's okay. If it means like asking a question on Twitter or Facebook to people and asking like, have you had experiences like this, or what should I do, or how should I go about this, then that's perfectly valid and something you should do, as long as you're standing up for yourself. And in classics in general, if you're not a cis white able-bodied man, you're going to learn how to advocate for yourself pretty fast, or there's going to be situations where you're going to have to learn how to do that. So yeah, I would say research universal design of learning, and try to create a classroom space where students don't need to come to you and disclose their disability to be able to be accommodated. As much as possible, you should try to make it so official accommodations aren't necessary, and that can be like when you show videos, put on subtitles, make sure the volume's loud, or recording your lectures for those who are sick more often, so they're able to see what went on during class, or do what I did and like send them detailed notes with a lot of resources, or make sure that you have discussion guidelines so everyone knows how to have a respectful discussion, and that everyone doesn't have all the same experiences, and that people might have different reactions to the text, and like do summaries before texts that are like violent in any way, or might have like, who knows, someone might be extremely afraid of fire, and if you like don't give them a warning about Troy burning, then they're going to get extremely upset. So like just summaries in general before text can be helpful. And yeah, make it so they don't have to disclose, but also make it so they're comfortable disclosing to you if they have to, and don't force them to spend $3,000 to get official diagnoses if they don't have to. Yeah. Yeah. And also for how to support disabled colleagues. Let that be on a case-to-case basis. Like for me, I will have a visible disability when I have my service dog with me. It'll be very obvious that she's a service dog and there's a reason why I have her with me all the time. But currently without her, my disabilities aren't seen. And yeah, so for me, I would want my colleagues to ask me like how they could support me rather than assuming ways they could support me. So I think it's a good way to like ask how to support your colleagues if they do disclose their disability, or if they have a seen disability, ask them how they want to be supported. Don't just assume. Like if you have a colleague in a wheelchair, don't just push them around without asking, because that's extremely ableist to just like touch another person's property and take their agency away from them and their mobility. And if you have like a blind colleague who uses a cane, don't like take them by the arm and lead them away, because then you're disorientating them. So definitely use that on a case-to-case basis, and advocate for your fellow colleagues. Like if they need an accommodations for work, make sure that you are fighting right there with them to get those, because that can be hard in higher academia.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so I would say I want students to take from my classes whatever they want to take from my class. I teach high schoolers, so they're not necessarily going to go into the classics field. Like they're not majoring in Latin or anything. I don't want to pressure them to. One, because I don't think this field is a good place to be and it's not healthy. So honestly, I'm not going to pressure anyone to go into it who doesn't want to. And I'm not trying to pressure them to memorize every single form and get everything perfect. Because if this isn't what they're going to do with their life, why does it really matter?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like a language where they're going to be able to go to a country and use it for communication. So I don't necessarily think Latin is that important, which might be controversial. And I don't care about grades. I want my students to do well, but I don't see grades as an indication of their understanding necessarily. And so I really just want them to take from it what they want. So if a student happens to be really interested in mythology and really wants to read this one specific myth in Latin, and they're able to do that because of my class, and that's wonderful, and that's a total successful outcome. Or if a student just wants to learn how to identify different word roots with Latin for the SAT, that's perfectly acceptable. If someone just wants to learn a little more about Roman history, then that's fine. So I really think the learning outcome depends on the class I'm teaching, and I hope I'm always able to adjust my understanding of those learning outcomes to fit my specific classes. Yeah.
Thank you for doing this interview with me.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Leah Borquez. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently an undergraduate at Bryn College and a prospective PhD student. I do ancient history. Specifically, at the moment, I work on Rome and Spain and issues of colonization and identity. And I also am interested in the reception in early Roman or early modern empire. I also do work on ancient mental health and its treatment. Also, my context here is I do suffer from depression, anxiety, and severe OCD, and have a couple other weird health things that really just are not helpful in the long run.
All right.
I'm not entirely sure, because of the way things manifest, and I haven't been in treatment for them for all that long, so I'm not entirely sure where I fall in that category. Do my various health conditions change the way I go about living? Yes, but also they tend to manifest themselves in ways that make things like accessibility services not feasible for me to use. Mm-hmm. So it's it falls in a gray area, and still not sure where I fall. I mean, I think one of the things that comes up a lot is when we're talking about the amount of reading that you have to do for classic students. I've had 2 concussions from unrelated. I guess obviously they're not related to classics. No one dropped a book on my head or anything, but I have had 2 concussions since being in my teens and I guess now 20s. And so it's actually impaired my ability to read languages for a long period of time, which makes doing work really difficult. Not to mention if I'm going through a depressive episode, or the subject, if we're not warned about the subject matter of a specific text and it has triggering content for past experiences, or I'm having intrusive thoughts at the time, I just can't get things done. I don't have the energy to get things done. I also just haven't, this is like my own personal experience, but like I haven't had best interactions in the classroom. So entering a new classroom space is always a really anxiety inducing time. And I've had experiences where I've had like panic attacks in the middle of class and had to leave, and not really feeling like I can go to professors to talk about that, because it's just sort of accepted that everyone knows what they're doing and like they're here for only the classics, and their comfort is really secondary to that, or their own experiences are really secondary to that. And it's gotten to the point where like I've had professors like pull me aside and be like, hey, what's happening? You suck in class, essentially. And like, to be fair, I was sucking in class, but the way that things manifest for me puts me in a position where I either have to disclose fully if something happens, or just work through it, because there's not really a way that I know of, at least, to get out of that. And some professors have been really accommodating and really kind, and receptive to things like that, and some have not. Like I didn't even realize that like with anxiety and stuff, I have really hard time asking for help if I need it, and even asking for things like extensions. And I didn't realize that was something I could do until my sophomore year of college, when I skipped class because of a depressive episode, and my professor reached out to me one-on-one just to make sure that I was doing okay, because I hadn't checked in with him, and just immediately offered the option of an extension or a redo for an assignment that I did while really depressed because it wasn't my best work. Mm-hmm. And that positive experience really has helped me a lot in figuring out how to ask for what I need, but that doesn't always happen. And, you know, that professor was also much more accommodating and also not a classics professor. So
okay, I was going to ask who.
No, he was a history professor. It's a weird position to be in, because I also just can't like email a professor and be like, hi, I'm having intrusive thoughts, because like half the times I don't really know what that is or what that entails, or like, well, can you send it back? Like, yeah, but like I will be thinking about, you know, someone coming in and shooting us the entire time in vivid detail. So it's not very productive on my end, I guess. Sense. For like context, I'm a TA and don't have control over lesson plans. So I see what the professor I'm teaching for is doing in the classroom, but because of FERPA and other things, I don't actually interact on accessibility terms with students, and they don't know that I don't know, which is its own weird situation that could come up. So there's that as a thing. I think having positive experiences with professors has really taught me what to do, if that makes sense. And that I know what's worked for me, and not generalizing accessibility terms, or not creating a, you know, you only get 2 absences, it doesn't matter if you're sick or whatever type policy that not only is ableist, but also inherently anti-Semitic, especially in fall semesters when high holy days tend to fall on weekdays and schools don't give off for weekdays. And then I just am like, oh, I guess I'll just never get sick or depressed. But and sort of thinking about how I would craft a schedule to not only help my students if they're struggling, but also provide enough flexibility to allow myself to have off days and not and find a way to make that work. I'm not entirely sure what that'll look like yet. I think it'll take some time, but yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Professors of classics, not so much. I'm primarily a history student, and like my advisor knows about my conditions, and I might have disclosed to 1 or 2 classics professors, but not unless it was really needed. There was a situation last semester where I did need to disclose, not just like that I was having like a long-term depressive episode, but like also other events that were happening in my life, to a professor, and that was a really hard experience. It's never, for me, it's never fun to have to disclose because you don't know how someone's going to react, or especially when it comes to mental health stuff, just not believe you because like, oh, but you come to class, or oh, but you do your work. And it's like, well, not everything manifests in the same way for everyone. And so it's, for me to voluntarily disclose as opposed to like I'm having issues so I have to disclose to be able to take care of myself, there has to be a certain baseline level of trust that is really difficult to build up, in my experience. And there are some professors that like I'll interact with them several times and then realize that like if I'm struggling, I'm not going to disclose. I'd rather take that L for my self-care and not have to be vulnerable, which is not good for my health, obviously. And it's also not good as a scholar because you don't want to be, or just as like a person, you don't want to be functioning when you can't be functioning well, because it just hurts you more. So yeah, it's very circumstantial for me. But I've had times it's gone really well, and I've had times that it's not gone well, and so it's one of those things that I sort of try to figure out on a more case-by-case basis. But yeah, generally it's been harder for me to trust classics professors than professors of other subjects.
That's fair.
I think with OCD, people think of OCD especially as being like you're organized all the time and you're counting everything and this sort of obsessive thing. And like, I mean, you can sort of see by my background, I don't obsessively clean. I'm generally a very cluttered person. But because of this like broader narrative of what OCD is that you always have to be organized, you're always on top of things, you're always counting things. That's not how it manifests. For me, it's more intrusive and compulsive. So do I count things? Like, yes, I don't remember a time when I've walked down a sidewalk and not tried to match how many steps were in each square, or, you know, I'm very routine based, and a break in routine can really throw off my mental health. But all of that also like affects things like sleep, or if I'm off my meds, it's on class, because I do take medication for intrusive thoughts. It's the only way I've really been able to effectively handle them. I've tried other things and it hasn't worked. And unfortunately, it's also a very uncommon medication, which means that there have been periods where I've had to ration or go without, which makes going to class difficult. Like physically, I can get up and go, but I never know when that type of thing will happen. And it makes interacting with new people pretty difficult as well. I feel like, I don't know, lesser known symptoms. I'm like trying to think like what do people know and what do people don't know? Not know. Because my anxiety is very panic based, so I do experience a lot of panic attacks. I guess it also sort of feeds into, so one of the things I alluded to earlier is that I have a medical condition where my nervous system is overreactive. It's essentially like my nervous system has anxiety, and so I use up bodily resources way too quickly. And the anxiety doesn't help with that because it also heightens those stress responders. So combining the two is never good, which means I have days where like I think I could be doing fine, and then I faint, or then I lose energy. And usually I can tell when those types of things are coming on and avoid it, but that's not always the case. And I've fainted in class before and then had to continue on my day, which is not great. But also people just sort of assume that like, oh, you haven't gotten enough rest or whatever. And it's really, sometimes that's part of it, but that's generally not what's going on. Any academic accommodations, because none of the conditions I have are considered learning disabilities, or classroom, whatever their terminology is for it. I do have an accommodation for housing, who's actually right here. This is Romeo. He's my therapy cat, emotional support animal. And he helps a lot with my OCD and compulsive thoughts, especially at night. And he's being a little bit of a butt right now, isn't he? But basically after talking with my therapist, we realized it'd probably be better for me to have like a living being around with me. But since I live on campus, Bryn Mawr requires undergraduates to live on campus for 4 years. I would need to go through the accommodations office. And it was a horrible experience, especially for something like this guy. You have to, first of all, our accessibility coordinator is an awful person. And she doesn't really care about students and their needs as opposed to Bryn Mawr's legal rights as an institution. So she basically made me relive all of my trauma and explain sort of what intrusive thoughts are to me and how they affect me, which is, difficult enough when you're going through it, but then describing it to someone else and feeling like they're gonna judge you for it, especially because mine tend to not be things like, what if I like ran really fast, or things that they're not generally harmless, and I don't act on them, but like the judgment is still there for a lot of people. And so having to go through that and then have her say to my face, oh, well, I have to deliberate and decide if this is really necessary, is just a lot. And I also had to fight to get my therapist to be able to advocate for me, because Bryn Mawr's process requires a note from a therapist and a psychiatrist, but they also don't want you to use employees of the college, which means that they don't generally take recommendations from people who work at their own health center, which is incredibly problematic for a lot of ways and makes a lot of blocks for people who have lower income and less access to things like transportation, because like I wouldn't be able to pay for transportation and for the cost of seeing a third-party therapist and psychiatrist, let alone like feeling the emotional toll doing things like intake takes on people who have gone to therapy. And because essentially I know you've done this, but like if anyone's watching and doesn't know what intake is, essentially you have to like start from like the beginning of your life and list everything that's wrong with you and wrong with your experience, and especially like I've had past traumatic experiences, not great to be forced to relive those on a regular basis. That's why people generally stay with the same therapist and psychiatrist. And I was able to get them to take the word of my therapist and psychiatrist at Bryn Mawr. And I eventually did get the accommodation, and it's made my life a lot better. And it's been great, even though the cat's a bit of a dick sometimes, but all cats are. It's been good since I've gotten it, but it was a horrible process to go through. And even though I went through it at the beginning of second semester last year, I actually didn't get the accommodation until this year. Mm-hmm. I just have a lot of limited energy when it comes to things outside the classroom, because, participating and being present and, fully engaging in class takes up so much energy or so many spoons, that being outside of that environment means I have a lot less to give around and dedicate to things like seeing my friends, which actually like genuinely helps my mental health. And also just like the stress of doing school, this is the issue with academia, right? Is that like you have so much you have to do during the day, but then it's expected that you work way beyond that and you put all of that other effort in, and there isn't enough hours in the day. And like, especially with undergraduates who are taking several classes at the same time, where all professors think that their class is the most important class. And if you're doing any extracurriculars and you're trying to see your friends, it's a hard balance. And sometimes it's not one that I can make, because there are sometimes that, if my mental health is really bad, that going to class is all I can do, or I can go to therapy, or I can go to class. And, in that case, I'm going to go to therapy. Like, it's not going to get any better otherwise. But especially with things like a lot of types of attendance policies are really difficult to deal with if you have to miss a lot of class, or just professors who assign an absurd amount of work and expect you to dedicate all of your time to that work. But it's like, I also have 3 or 4 other things that need my attention. Mm-hmm. And so balancing it is really difficult, especially when like there are other things I could be doing that would increase my energy and increase my mood. I don't think I have an answer to that. Like what is even the right thing to do? I don't know. But yeah, there are just days that I just can't do much because I don't have the mental energy to, or like I don't, it's all like noise in dining halls can be really overwhelming and be really anxiety and panic inducing for me. But then the question is, then how do I get food? I can't wait to have a kitchen. It's going to be so nice. I can't wait to have a kitchen. It's going to be great. But it's things like that you have to think about, because if you're thinking, okay, I have X and Y that I know I need to do today, and then there's Z, which will be good for me, then there are all of these other things that also I should do. But it's like, do I have the energy to? Are they going to induce more panic? Is this going to cause an intrusive thought later on? Will I get such a bad headache from studying so closely that I won't be able to think properly? Will I faint? It's a lot of other factors you have to take into account. Because I also study mental health as like an academic interest, I actively try to change the way, or when I talk to people about it, especially other people who teach on medicine, people who teach on mental health and disability, to like make sure they know what they're saying and how that it's not like it's not a one-way street. You can't just be like, oh, we're talking about antiquity, it's fine. No, like you're interacting with another human being, and the language you use matters, and the theory you use matters. Like obviously being a part of this panel was a really great opportunity for me to, bring that to a larger scale. But I don't know if it's advocacy, but I do try to like help. It's not advocacy per se, but I do try my best to help people that, like my other friends who also have issues, be able to reach out and get the help that they need, whether that's through an accommodations office or direct emails with their professors. And if like they can't do it that time, being able to take over with them, and like maybe like if I get something dictated to me and do that, or something else, just so that we can all get what we need to operate at some, semblance of a level.
Yeah.
It's hard. And I don't have a right answer. And like, I guess that's okay. But it's really find your support network, both outside of classics, and find one or two professors or more senior, whoever that you can trust. It doesn't have to be every person you come across, but make sure that you can find someone that you can trust to be an advocate, because that makes your life so much easier. Like I had a situation, like my advice, like I said, mentioned, I've disclosed to my advisor and he knows basically my whole situation. And I had a situation earlier that there needed to be a conversation that I didn't know if I was ready to have with a different professor. And without asking, he offered his support to either take that conversation there, because the person I had to have the conversation with was also a professor, so they were equal in rank, and therefore the respect and the gravity of the situation would be there, where it might not be guaranteed between a student and a professor. And having someone like that in your corner is really important, I think, because that way you know that like if something goes wrong, or if you need someone who, like, I know it shouldn't be like this, but like that's the way academia works, right? Is that you need someone who does hold more weight to really, go to bat for you if you need it. And obviously, like, keeping hobbies and friends, if you can, outside of the field as well as inside of the field. It's important to get a break. Rethink your attendance policy. That's like my biggest issue. No matter what you're teaching, not only does it allow students to be sick, does it allow them to take the time to take care of themselves that they need? Are you making it so aggressive that people don't feel like they can come to you if they do need time? And that's true with extensions as well as as well as attendance policies, but it's really there with attendance policies, because sometimes people want to engage but can't, or being in the classroom is actively harmful to them, because I've been in those situations before. And if you don't make yourself available, or, you know, if you're nasty, no one's going to come and talk to you. But part of that's also just the way you word it, you know, even just saying like, let me know if you can't be there, and that's enough. And if it becomes a repeated problem, we can have a talk about it, about what's going on, but we don't have to. It has to be a non-judgmental space. And again, I know it's not about disability, but especially in fall semesters, sometimes those policies can be anti-Semitic. Thinking about Jewish students and who need to go to the holy days, and I'm sure this is issues with Muslim students and students of other religions as well. I'm just Jewish, so this is just something I've had to deal with my entire life, so I'm familiar with it. So there's that. And specifically if you're teaching a class on disability or doing lesson on disability, watching language, watching tone, making sure you give enough warnings. But this is all stuff I talked about in the actual conference, so I don't really want to, you know, beat a dead horse. Really? I mean, other than like, just like be a decent person, you know what I mean? Don't make sure like spaces that you're trying to do either work things in their something that are accessible to people, make sure they're not triggering, making sure maybe if you know that there's a history between two people, that doesn't become an active issue for someone, or put all of that stress onto one person in that situation, because that usually ends up being on, if it's a negative interaction, like the victim or the person who was hurt. I don't know what other resources, I just haven't been in the situation, so I don't. I'm sure there are different needs, and I just don't know what they are.
So, are there any questions you want me to ask you, or any subjects we haven't gone over that you want to share with the whole world?
The entire world. I think I'm good.
Okay.
Unless you want to see Romeo again.
Yeah.
There he is.
My name is Tara Wells. I use she, her, hers, and I'm currently in a master's program at the University of Maryland, a master's program in classics on the Latin and Greek track, and in the pool for PhD programs in classics more broadly and or ancient history. And yeah, I did my undergrad at Oberlin College, double majoring in Latin and Greek, and my research interests are mostly in kind of identity and representation of marginalized groups. I do. It has been, it's something that I've thought about a lot, whether or not I do. And I think that in itself shows just how murkily defined and murkily perceived disability is. Because I suffer from chronic pain and fibromyalgia. And so I have good days and I have bad days. So I'm not always the same level of disabled, I guess. So depending on how my symptoms flare and when they flare, that makes me feel more or less disabled. But I would consider myself disabled in the sense that I have difficulty performing many daily tasks, and it affects my academic abilities significantly. It has been difficult, for sure, because a lot of my chronic pain is manifested as migraines and headaches, which are made worse by reading, and much of classics is reading. So it's very hard to do a lot of the work sometimes, and I really have to cut a lot of corners and figure out what I can read and how much of it to be able to get enough of a sense of what I'm supposed to take away from the reading. But generally, I'm not able to complete the full readings. And so then I think that has to be supplemented with being there in class for discussions, which is then also made difficult by my disability. When I'm in too much pain to get to class, or don't have the energy to really participate as fully as I would like to. So that definitely makes it really difficult. And again, there are good days and there are bad days. So, and sometimes it's a lot easier. But there are a number of days where it's really, really hard. And that, of course, then leads to a lot of depression and anxiety about it, and being worried about, okay, am I going to be able to perform well in this class today? Or am I going to like have a panic attack in the middle of it and not be able to really pay attention, and then just feel really bad about not being there fully and not being able to pay attention fully. And then I go home that night, and then I'm just depressed thinking about how I wasn't able to do as well as I wanted to. And that makes me sad. And then, as I'm in the process of PhD program applications and responses, it's like it constantly makes me wonder, okay, can I actually handle doing this? But I've really tried to reframe that question as not can I handle it, but can I find a program that will support me properly so that I can handle it, and so that I can I find people who will work with me to make it equitable. Something that's been important for me is being able to, well, I mean, of course, it depends on having good professors who are understanding of this, because I've also had some who aren't, but we'll get to that. But having professors who I can say to them, hey, I'm having a really bad headache today, and can't really participate fully, and knowing that they're going to not hold that against me, and knowing that they know that, I'm not just lazy or slacking off or not paying attention, but I'm sitting there in very much pain. And it's so being able to have a conversation with the professor and being able to trust them and know that they trust me, that has made things work. But of course, again, that depends on having very specific good people around you, who you're open and comfortable with, which is not something that happens everywhere. I would say also, I've had to work really hard to be more transparent with my peers and make it clear to them that, my body and my brain work differently than the normal ones. And so, especially in like translation courses, when people kind of instantly want to jump in and give the answer if someone takes more than 30 seconds to think of what this word means, having to explain, hey, I just need like an extra minute to think about it and kind of like calm myself through the anxiety of trying to read this and not like be in too much pain to do it. And so I found that when I am more transparent about my disability, people are then more understanding of it, and then are able to, I think, understand where I'm coming from and understand what I'm going through, and adjust their behavior accordingly. But that's also then really frustrating, because then it gets to the idea of, it's stinks that people assume that everyone is just able enough to behave in the way that an able-bodied person, an able-minded person wants to behave, and assuming that everyone else functions in the same ways. So yeah, I've found being more transparent works and makes a difference and helps, but it's really hard to be transparent, and it's hard to feel like you should have to be, and you don't have to be. So it's a hard balance, and I think it really depends on the class and the group that you're with. But I think I've had more positive experiences when I've been able to feel comfortable being open about it. So things that haven't worked for me, again, the amount of reading that classics depends on. and academia in general depend on. I think those are really ableist assumptions that people can read massive amounts of reading at the same pace as each other, and with the same clarity as each other. And I think, again, right, that's why we have classes and seminars and discussions then to discuss things. But I think discussions are always based on a very, again, ableist assumption that everyone is starting at the same point of clarity. And I think a good professor begins by asking about questions about the reading and understanding about the reading generally before jumping into a discussion about, okay, we all clearly understand what this is about. Now let's talk about it outside of that. That, I think, is when there's an ableist assumption preceding that. So that doesn't work when I'm unable to complete the readings and then have to sit there and feel bad, but also feel and be unable to participate fully, but also have to sit there constantly telling myself that it's not my fault and that, you know, I did as much as I could, and that it's not something that I've done wrong, and that really it's unfair that I'm expected to perform at the same level as someone who doesn't have the same impairment as I do. So that doesn't work. But again, that can be, I think, adjusted for when people are properly supporting me and, you know to expect differing levels of performance and are okay with that. More than anything, it's just having people be okay with it and understanding it and saying, okay, what could you do? What did you do? And let's work from there. So that's probably been one of the biggest issues for me. I also think another just like very practical random thing is that classrooms often have very fluorescent lighting, which is just bad for my eyes and my head. And I think it is for really like anyone, even if you don't have chronic pain that's triggered by it. But I really think that schools need to put more investment and thought into the spaces that they're putting students into. And yeah, I don't know. I guess I see a lot of rebuilding and renovation, new buildings always going on all over the place, but I still don't feel like they're necessarily designed. Like, we think about like making buildings accessible in a sense of like mobile accessibility, but I think that we often, or builders and designers, don't necessarily often think about making buildings accessible in ways beyond that. Yeah, so that also always causes me a lot of problems, but it's hard to say, hey, can we, have class in a totally different classroom, or like turn the lights off, or can I wear sunglasses, and feel really weird and have everyone stare at me the whole time? Yeah, that's something that I haven't really figured out a solution to, other than yelling at people. It definitely makes me much more open and understanding in general in the world, and like having my disability has made me, I think, less judgmental and less assumptive of the world around me, because I've been dealing with my disability for about 7 years. So it's opened my eyes a lot to just kind of the things that we take for granted when we're able-bodied and able-minded. And so then I think it makes me, it's hard because it makes me angry, because I'm constantly angry when people don't think, oh, everyone's not the same as me. But I also know that that's on my end, you know, people who haven't experienced being disabled, it's unfair for me to assume that they would think about that also, if you know what I'm saying. I don't know, that kind of got muddled, but like, I don't want them to assume that I'm able-bodied, but that first of all means I'm assuming that they're assuming that. But when they do things that make it clear that they are assuming that, you know, like in Rome recently, an elderly woman told me to get out of my seat so that she could sit down, and you know, I had to be like, no, because I'm tired and my muscles are weak and I'm in pain. And she didn't understand what I was saying because we were speaking different languages, but you know, and then I wanted so badly to try to explain to her, like, I'm not just because I look young doesn't mean, and like I don't look disabled doesn't mean that I'm not. But you know, she was just an angry old Italian woman anyway. But yeah, so then that makes me think about like, you know, I automatically assume what she is assuming about me, that she's assuming, oh, I'm just some young lazy kid who is sitting there on the phone, doesn't want to give up my seat because I'm rude or entitled or whatever. But I also don't know that that's what she was thinking, you know. So I don't know. I see both sides of it, and anyway. So then bringing that to the classroom, right? It makes me much more open to, I don't know, just the fact that people learn in different ways, and I think it's helped me be a little bit less angry as a teacher when students are like on devices and stuff, and or when students are like talking or seem distracted. You know, I know that just everyone's brains work in different ways, and that just because they seem distracted doesn't necessarily mean they are, or maybe they need to be distracted for a minute, and that's okay. And so it's made me more accepting and like less judgmental, and always, you know, focused. It makes me not always be focused on like, oh, this kid is like on their phone scrolling right now, that means that they're being rude and not paying attention on purpose, which is also hard because a lot of times I think that is what's happening. Because I teach I teach courses that are like gen ed fulfilling, and so a lot of the students are very certainly not interested in the course material, but it does make me like second guess myself a lot of times and think, you know, not to assume what students' needs are. And I mean, I'm always anyways very open about, please talk to me, and feel free letting me know what you need and stuff. But it also makes me think about the fact that I have to know that some people don't want to talk to me, and that's okay too. And you know, unless they're being disruptive or causing like a really big problem, you just have to accept that people need to do what they need to do. And so I think that that's made me a little bit more laid back and like less mean as a teacher. But I don't know, there are still a lot of students who I know take advantage of my like kindness in that sense, and that's frustrating. So it's still a struggle, and I imagine it always will be, but that's something that yeah, I again struggle with a lot, and knowing when to do so, because I don't want to be defined by my disability, of course. And I think a lot of us feel this way, that it's very hard to know, because like I said, I've had more positive experiences the more open and transparent I've been. But it's really hard to be open and transparent because not everyone is accepting or understanding. And it's very annoying then and burdening. People expect me to explain it or like give them more information. So by opening up, I open myself to that risk. And my chronic illness is very, I think, misunderstood or not known at all. So then people always are like wanting to know what I'm talking about when I say I have fibromyalgia. And on the one hand, I want people to understand it, but I also hate that I have to explain myself, and that like that there's not enough awareness about it that people know what it is. Or sometimes people will be like, oh yeah, fibromyalgia, and then like think they know what it is, but then are wrong. And so then that's also frustrating as well. So there are definitely a lot of like hesitations with wanting to open up about it and having to explain those things, and being worried about that. But, and again, I hate when I open up about my disability and then people like see me as some kind of superhero for continuing in academia, and they're like, wow, you do such good work and work so hard for someone who is struggling with this. And I'm like, yeah, but like I would be struggling with it either way, so I'm just doing what I want to do. And all that matters is that that there are systems in place that allow me to be able to continue to do it, just as easily as anyone else. But yeah, so that, I don't know, it's nice to hear, especially on the hard days when I'm thinking, can I do this anymore? But it's also, I don't know, depending who it's coming from and when, it, I think, makes a difference of how I receive it. And yeah, I, again, don't want to be defined by it. I don't want people to think, oh, that's Tara, she's the one with fibromyalgia. That's not who I am. I'm so much more than that. So I don't want to be defined by my disability, which is also hard because it is an important part of who I am, for sure, and has changed me a lot over the past few years of struggling with it. But again, yeah, I'm more than that, and it's not why I'm good at what I do, and it's not why I'm a hard worker. I've always been a hard worker. It makes me maybe work harder, but I think in a way it also makes me have to work harder because it's harder to do work. So yeah, so it's hard to feel comfortable opening up. I think I feel most comfortable opening up after I have I don't know, definitely once I like have spoken a few times with a professor or a colleague, and feel like they're a nice person who would understand if I say, hey, by the way, if I seem really grumpy all the time, it's because I'm constantly in pain, so like don't mind me. And also I guess once I figure out how to say that, because like with some people I can be humorous like that, and with some people I have to be kind of very straightforward and like, this is something that you might not understand, but here's what's going on and can we work with it. So I've had both kind of experiences, and both have turned out fine. With my students, I question whether or not I should tell them, because I feel like it's interesting. I had one student a couple semesters ago who told me that she had some accommodations and would maybe be absent from class sometimes. And I was like, oh, no problem. I totally understand. I have fibromyalgia and chronic pain. And then that made her really trust me and open up to me, and was like, wow, a teacher who understands what I'm going through, because it ended up that she was struggling with the same issues. And so then she really felt like she could be honest with me about her bad days. And that really gave us a good open connection. So then that made me think, oh, I wonder if I should tell my students at the beginning of the semester so they understand where I'm coming from and my own perspective, because I really push for, because I lead discussion sections, and I think that having discussions are most effective when you have a good understanding of who you're having a conversation with and the different backgrounds that people are coming from, and different perspectives and different experiences. So I really press for them to like be inclusive in bringing in their own experiences and sharing their different voices, right? So on the one hand, I think I should be open with them and share my experience and be vulnerable and open that opportunity for them to trust me, or if it's going to make an extra connection or make someone feel more comfortable telling me when they're feeling poorly or when they have an issue going on in their life that's affecting their work. I want people to feel comfortable being open with me about that, because then I can respond accordingly and with understanding, right? If they don't know what's going on, it's harder to. But then I also feel like, first of all, for them, right, I understand when they don't want to have to do that, because I've been in the place that I don't want to have to open up and don't feel like I shouldn't have to. And then as a teacher, especially, I feel like it's hard because I want to have a certain level of privacy, and I question how much should they know about me, and how much do I feel like they should get to know about me, because I also want there to be that privacy and that separation. So it's hard, and I so far have not opened up and told a whole class about my disability, but sometimes I think that I should, because then there are days when I'm like having really bad back pain and I want to sit down and I want to be like, hey guys, FYI, my pain is flaring up today and I'm gonna sit down. But it's also been fine when I've just decided to sit down and not validate it with an explanation. So I don't know, something that I still think about and question a lot, for sure. So fibromyalgia is, I think, a pretty unknown thing, or not properly known. There are a lot of, I think even like doctors don't really understand what it is still, and so there are different kind of short explanations for it, and I've heard several, and yeah, because some people think it's a nerve thing, like a nerve pain problem. Some people think it's a muscular thing. Some people characterize it as kind of an autoimmune type thing, or autoimmune acting type thing, but it's not technically autoimmune because it doesn't test as an autoimmune test. So it's really not understood medically or socially, and I think I kind of go with the explanation that it's fibromyalgia means like sensitive body being sensitive to pain, or like responding with pain in situations that a body not affected by fibromyalgia would not respond in those ways. So it's, a lot of people, I think, don't understand that I am in constant pain, and they can't fathom that possibility, and or don't believe that it's true, which is incredibly frustrating, of course, because it is true, and so they can't understand how hard it is, and a big symptom that goes along with it is just fatigue and having minimal energy, and of course, right, fellow spoonies know, right, having not having minimal spoons to start the day, or no spoons, and so people don't understand, when there are days that I feel like I could go to class, but then won't be able to do my homework for the next day, and then I have to make that choice, and then people are like, well, why can't you do both? And they don't get the reality that I literally don't have the energy to do both, or don't have the capacity to do both. Or if I'm like, okay, I prepared for class and feel like I could go to class, but the bus ride to get to class is going to drain my energy, and then I won't be able to do class.
Yeah.
So I should just stay home and not use that energy on class or the bus ride. And then it's like, what do I do at home? And that's just something that I can understand is not comprehensible if you haven't experienced it. And so I wish that there were a way for people to understand it without having to experience it, so that more people would understand it. But I don't know how to solve that problem, other than people being understanding and just doing their best to be empathetic. I don't know the difference. I always get them mixed up. But just people trying to be as understanding as possible, even if they don't fully understand it. Just honestly trusting me and believing me and recognizing that what I'm saying is true, even if they don't get it. Yeah, so the fatigue, I think, is a generally misunderstood and difficult to understand thing for people who don't have it, and lack of energy. And again, my difficulty with reading and getting headaches from reading too much. People don't understand that. Yeah, I would say that those are the big ones. And again, all of the kind of the depression and anxiety that's spurred from it, people don't understand how much it affects my life beyond just physically. Also, mentally, it is so draining and really affects every day. Even if the pain isn't there, it can really affect mentally how I'm able to think about my life and what I'm doing with my life and what I want to do with my life. So yes, I have gone through the accommodations process at both institutions that I've attended. At my undergraduate institution, I did not want to go through the accommodation process, and I didn't want to do it at my master's institution either. And I'm still very bitter that I had to do it at all, ever. But I literally had a professor in undergrad who refused to be accommodating unless I was officially registered with the Office of Disability Services. Mm-hmm. So I finally gave in and did the process, and it was incredibly frustrating, which is why I hadn't done it. Yeah, it was really frustrating to have to do it. It was really, it took a very long time to get an appointment, and by the time I got an appointment, it was like towards the end of the semester, and felt like, what was the point of doing this? Granted, then it made it easier for future semesters, and then I had the accommodations in place, and it was just like a renew each semester kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But each time that I have to have a conversation with someone in an official capacity about my disability, it is so incredibly draining and frustrating, and just takes so much explaining and background and revisiting horrible times of my life to open up to them about this, all just to have it on a piece of paper when I, could just show my prescription for medication and say, look, I see a doctor about this. It's real. I have it. Or even just being able to say, I shouldn't, like, you can be disabled and not have to see medical professionals about it, or have some kind of official documentation. So I just wish that people would accept that without needing it on a document. So yeah, I literally had a professor who would not accept that and be accommodating. And then, like, the thing is, nothing changed about my ability between getting the accommodation letter and before I had it. But then once I had it, he was suddenly super understanding and super like, oh, okay, yeah, it's okay that you have to miss this many classes, and we can work with this, and sure, you can like take the test at a later date. But before that, he was always like, no, you're missing too many classes, no, you really need to be in class, no, you're not doing well enough, no, this isn't okay. And even though I was explaining to him in the same way what my limitations were, he just refused to accept them. There was literally a time that I was in the hospital and had like a friend help me email him that I was going to miss class in 10 minutes because I was in the emergency room. And his response was something along the lines of, I understand that you're struggling with this, but you really need to make a bigger effort to be in class. Literally in the hospital, and tells me I need to make a stronger effort to be in class. So that was a whole horrible, frustrating process. And especially because my accommodations are pretty much just for professors to be understanding when if symptoms flare up and cause me to miss like a whole slew of things for a little while. Because kind of day to day I can manage and cope and stuff, but if things flare up really badly for a little while, that can really cause me to miss a lot.
Yeah.
So for them to work with me on extensions and absences when those things happen. And generally there's probably like 2 or 3, I probably missed 2 or 3 classes of every class each semester, because just at some point I'm just worn out and just need a day. And it happens to fall on a class day. So just being accommodating with absences. So it's like, that's something that most of my professors before him had been fine accommodating without an accommodation letter, and just me having this conversation with them and saying, okay, this is what I struggle with. And then, when things would flare up, I'd email them and say, hey, I'm not doing well today, I'm going to miss class. And it was fine. But then when I had this professor, it was not fine. So then similarly, when I got to my master's program, it's a 2-year program. I didn't feel like I needed to register or anything. I didn't want to have to do this. But then I similarly had a professor who was like, who told me that it would be easier for him to be accommodating if I had the official letter, which in an official capacity I can understand. You feel like I can see how a professor can feel like it's not fair for them to be lenient with me on attendance if they're not lenient with another student on attendance. But I also think that, if they have the documentation of my emails saying, hey, this is what's going on, why can't that be enough? So again, this professor told me like, it would be easier if I got registered with the accessibility and disability services, or accommodations and disability services. And I had just moved here. It was like my first semester, and I had seen one doctor to like get my prescription refilled. And of course, ADS requires like that medical professionals or counselors or whoever fill out a form certifying, your issues and making recommendations for how you can, for what accommodations can help you. And this doctor who I had seen, who I'd only seen, again, to refill my prescription, and so that I would have someone here to talk to if things flared up. But by that point, I really wasn't looking for like anyone to see on a regular basis or anything. I didn't need that. I just needed someone in case, right? So I had seen this guy once, and he turned out to be an awful doctor, and I didn't see him anymore. But he wouldn't fill out the form because he had only seen me once. And luckily, I had started seeing an acupuncturist who had like daily records of the things that I would say about how my disability was so debilitating. And so the office did accept those, but technically she wasn't an MD that they required. And they accepted it anyway, but I had to go through a lot of stress of worrying whether or not they would accept it, and stress of reaching out to first this one doctor who wouldn't work with me, and dealing with making all of that contact, which is extremely draining. And when I'm already drained enough just trying to do my regular work, it's like the thing that these professors don't understand is when I'm already struggling that much to just do the work that they want me to do for their class, for them to then ask me to do all this extra work to get accommodation letters so that I can be officially accommodated in missing their class if I need to once in the semester. That's so much work to do for something that could be the exact same if the professor would just believe me and accommodate me themselves anyway. So yeah, I had to go through a lot with that, and then, contacting the acupuncturist to fill out the forms, and then it was the same thing. It took forever for me to get an appointment, and then the chair of my department, who was incredibly understanding and helpful in this process, and she was really lovely and has been super supportive of me the whole time, and always checks in with me. She's wonderful. She reached out to the head of the disability office and was able to get my appointment moved to immediately.
Right.
So that's great, but it also made me really mad because I'm like, if that appointment existed,
Why couldn't
and you were able to accommodate the schedule when the chair was brought in to talk to you, what's the difference between that and me needing the accommodation anyway, So yeah, accommodation processes are incredibly frustrating, and again, I think the biggest thing is that it just the requirements for getting an accommodation and the paperwork that you have to go through and the contact you have to make with all of the people to do the paperwork on your behalf, it's just so much. And when you're already struggling, and that's why a lot of people don't do it, and that's why I didn't do it for the longest time, because it just takes so much work, and for generally, I don't know, for me at least, very little result. Again, results that I feel like could easily have been accomplished without all of the mess that I had to go through, that makes no difference in the professor's life, really, but really significantly negatively impacted my life and add a lot of stress, and then send me into a day of being depressed about my disability, and then that's a day where I'm not able to do my schoolwork.
Okay.
Yeah, but no, I haven't had any issues as far as people not, because since my accommodation is pretty much just be an understanding kind person. Yeah, it impacts my life very significantly. Again, good days and bad days, but pretty much every day, really just getting up in the morning is a hard enough thing, let alone to get up and get ready and go to class and do homework and study and go to the different places and different buildings, and I start off the day really already in a lot of pain and really drained, so then that escalates throughout the day and it makes it very hard to be awake and trying to function. So it's, physically debilitating in those ways, and then there's the depression and anxiety that goes along with it, kind of constantly worrying about how the day is going to go, because it's such an unpredictable sort of illness that I can't know for sure what's going to suddenly flare up or what's going to be a problem that day, or how to combat it until it happens. And then when it happens, I generally, the only recovery option is taking a day to rest and just sit in bed all day. So yeah, it's a pretty vicious cycle. And yeah, not, it's not an easy, sustainable way to live my life. But I would say, I guess, just taking care of myself is generally how I cope through it. And there's one medication that has helped significantly with my overall muscle functionality. But it still is not easy at all. And there are a lot of hard days and mental difficulties with it. I was going to say something else. I forgot. It's important to find people who are in similar situations like us, and reaching out to people through there's the whole Slack channel, which I still haven't joined, but there's a whole network of disabled classicists to connect with, and I think that having that network is what can make it possible for a lot of people. For me, just having the couple of friends who I have who, like yourself, who I know understand and are like living similar lives and struggling with similar things, that makes it a million times easier just to have someone to talk to who understands it, and to know that, you know, other people exist who are going through it, who are succeeding, and being able to do what they enjoy, and make the differences that they want to make. I would say, again, I encourage transparency about it and openness about it, both like with professors and people you're dealing with personally, but I also think just talking about it on social media again and in life daily raises much more awareness and understanding about disability in general. I think it's something that's really misunderstood in the world. Again, just the assumption that everyone is able-bodied and able-minded is something that a lot of people have not been confronted with having to acknowledge or think about on any level. So I would say my biggest advice is just to talk about it and share experiences as much as you're comfortable. Or if you're not comfortable sharing your own experiences, sharing the experiences of others who have shared their experience. Yeah. And I guess my biggest advice would be like, it's possible. There are people who are there to support you and who care and are good people and do the right things and respond in the right ways. But it's hard to find them sometimes, but they're there. And I would say if you're at a place where they aren't there, go somewhere else, which is, I mean, a very, very privileged thing to say. And obviously it's not as easy as that, but the places exist. And if you can get there, I recommend going to those places. I would say more than anything to just listen and understand and believe them again. Again, there are just so many experiences, or not so many, but like a handful of major experiences that I've had that would have been so much easier if I could just be believed by my own word, rather than needing official documentation and bullshit paperwork, right? So number one, just believing and listening. And I would also say it's super important when you're faced with something that you don't understand fully, to educate yourself about it and to do it in a way that doesn't burden the person who is telling you about it. You know, I think asking questions and having them educate you to the whatever extent they're comfortable with is fine, but you know, we have plenty of technology and resources that if someone says, oh, I have this disability, I have this illness, I struggle with this, you can write that down and go look it up on your own time and try to understand it and come back to them from a more informed point already, and be able to say, hey, this is kind of what I found out, and is this accurate for your experience, or how can I adjust for your experience? This is the advice that I've seen from others about how to help with this experience. Is that what I can do for you? And that's, I think, the biggest question to always ask them is what, even if you don't understand what they're going through, asking them and figuring out what you can do for them to help them, because that's all we need a little extra help, and we just need a little extra support, and we can be as successful, if not more successful, than anyone else.
Yeah.
You know? Educate yourself, and first educate yourself, and then come to them and support them however they tell you they need to be supported. This is a really great question. I'm in a Latin pedagogy class for this semester. So yesterday we spent like 6 hours talking about our goals for teaching Latin and learning Latin. So that's it's very relevant right now. I would say, I definitely don't, I couldn't care less about grades and numbers, and I hate that I have to give grades at all. I think the most important thing to me is that people take something away that means something to them, and that they connect with the material in a way that's relevant to their own life, even if it's like the tiniest story from a myth that they resonate with and they think is a good lesson for life. Yeah, that's the biggest thing.
Yourself?
Yeah, my name is Clara Bosak-Schroeder. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I use she and they pronouns, and my research looks mostly at environmental humanities and reception studies in classics. Oh yeah, I live with chronic pain, fatigue, and anxiety, and I was never formally diagnosed, but the onset of all of that was around the age of 16. I also sometimes describe myself as chronically ill, but disabled is often a bigger tent, and helpful for solidarity. I got my PhD in 2015, and I used various accommodations in college, but I was completely closeted in grad school. So I never faced any discrimination, but I found coursework really brutal and really brutalizing. I felt guilty and exhausted all of the time, and nobody discriminated against me, but nobody made the sort of environment that would allow me to question the pace at which I was working, the way I took exams, various things that could have really improved my quality of life. So I would say my experience of being a classic student was being really oppressed by an ableist structure rather than by individuals. It's partly that in college, I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, and there was a very clear path towards disclosure and accommodations, and a disability services office that would negotiate that for me with faculty, so that I wasn't the interface. But when I got to graduate school, there was nothing like that, and there may have been something that I wasn't aware of, but it was never extended to me. And on the contrary, I felt like the whole culture of classics at that level was about being sort of completely devoted to working all the time, performing your work, and there was a sort of unspoken sense that if you couldn't take it, you should get out. And so I just felt very, very much like it was not safe for me to talk about my illnesses.
Yeah. So
and I would say I did share a bit with a few other students over time, and was very well supported by them. And it's quite possible that my faculty would have also been supportive, but I never told them. The thing I most needed was more time, like for the degree. So I did my degree in 5 years so that I could take fewer classes as I went along. And that was really an effective privilege, the fact that I could, my family could pay for the tuition. And I think if that hadn't been the case, or if I had also been trying to work, I don't know if I ever would have finished. That was an extreme privilege. Also, something that disability services paid for were note takers. And that made a huge difference, especially when I was in reading courses where I had to make long vocabulary lists. I had another classic student who was a friend do that for me, and that was incredibly helpful. I guess the looking back, the thing that I think I sort of suffered with without questioning it was the way classrooms are set up. So, I do much better in certain chairs versus others. And that's something that I've learned over time. I also can't sit for prolonged periods. And that was much more of an issue in grad school where there were these long classes. But even in undergrad, I think I would have benefited from more flexibility in terms of like classroom space, and feeling like it wouldn't be so weird to bring in a piece of equipment. And that was more of a cultural barrier. It wasn't until I met graduate students with disabilities as a faculty member that I really began to rethink my own approach to being closeted or being out. And in particular, there's a PhD student here in a different department who's has no choice about being out about their disabilities. And I realized that watching them negotiate that gave me the courage to consider it as well. And I also felt this really, really strong desire that the graduate students in our department, my department now, wouldn't have the same experience that I had. And so I realized that sort of all of that came together to make me decide to start disclosing, slowly first to my students actually, and then to my colleagues. And I would say that the way that's affected me in the classroom is in two ways. First, I've become a lot clearer about my learning outcomes and what I want students to gain out of the experience of the class, instead of just doing the sort of the pieces of a course that I would have come to expect. Like we have tests, or we write papers, or we sit in this for 50 minutes and do a certain thing. And I think when I was first starting teaching, I did that. I just followed that script because it was, I didn't know what I was doing, and it was something to hold on to. And as I've gotten more confident as a teacher, I've also started to feel like I can play with the form of education a lot more, and especially start to critique the foundations of education and how we are forming students, and really affecting their minds and their bodies in these extremely prescriptive spaces. That has enormously negative effects on them and us, and also doesn't necessarily promote learning. So I'm in the midst of that, I think, and sort of how this shapes my teaching. This semester, for the first time, I'm doing trying to employ a few elements of collaborative grading, or what's called ungrading, where students and the instructor work to assign grades and determine rubrics. And that's very exciting. And I think that opening things up in that way does make classrooms more accessible and inclusive. I have had to cancel class or move it online a few times because I'm having a flare. My colleagues actually are encouraging me to do that more. Good. Which says something about how wonderful they are. And that's something I'm still struggling with, is sort of letting go of my notion of what our schedule should be, and sticking to the syllabus and all of that, and just being more flexible with myself. In the classroom, sometimes I've had students write for me, since I have a hard time writing, especially like in a language class. I can't put paradigms up on the board, so that sort of thing. Although now that I've started using PowerPoint more, I think that's been less of an issue.
Mm-hmm.
I've also, and we'll get to this, I know you wanted to ask about like best practices,
yeah.
but I tell my students about my disabilities on the first day as part of and like an invitation for them to talk to me about their disabilities if they feel comfortable, and their challenges in general. And I think that talking about I encourage them to think about like how could we make the class as accessible for them as possible? Like, does that mean doodling? Does it mean getting up and pacing or leaving the class briefly? These sorts of invitations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've been less willing to offer that to myself.
Yeah.
And so I'm starting to try to imagine that more concretely.
That's good.
Yeah. Something concrete I have done is I just basically decided that I can't hold 3-hour seminars. I also don't think they're particularly effective pedagogically, but they're really bad for me physically. And that has been this semester I held fast to that with my colleagues, and they were ultimately supportive, although I think a little unclear on why I was insisting. But that, I think that the 3-hour seminar as a thing we do in the humanities is something that people have a lot of feelings about, positive or negative. So I think it just brought up a lot more thoughts on their part. I have really just sort of undifferentiated chronic pain and fatigue, in the sense that like it doesn't attach to a particular diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And so I don't actually really know what's going on in my body a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And that variation, I think, is something that is hidden to other people, because I project a lot of energy and cheerfulness and, productivity. And so I think people tend to forget that I'm sick at all. And then I have to sort of go through this awkward conversation when I need to reschedule something or cancel something. And I think I'm trying to think if there's anything else in particular. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that's mostly it. It's more just like needing to reassert the fact of the disabilities. Mm-hmm. Something I have started getting migraines, and that's a whole other thing. Although in some ways it's more legible to people. Mm-hmm. So that I find myself actually more willing to, or more comfortable, less self-conscious about talking about the migraines than the rest of it. Yeah. I think people also they just don't know that I'm in pain most of the time. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, I'm not talking about it. But that has its it has its effects. It's very exhausting to be in pain. It was so straightforward. I have very little memory of it anymore. Okay. I just sort of got a letter and that was, I had a few appointments and it was very chill. I recently went through another accommodations process as a faculty member, which I had been here a few years before I started that, and I had a very positive experience, a really good advocate, and my colleagues were very responsive. But I think what I'm still unclear about is, as a faculty member, what is a reasonable accommodation? Mm-hmm. And everyone they're pretty willing to buy me equipment, and to get me a parking spot and things like that. Mm-hmm. But the things that would make a real difference to me would be reducing my work or spreading it out over longer periods of time than the pace of the university really allows for. And so, I think to truly make academia accessible, for me at least, would mean, questioning the foundations of production, basically, and what we think the value is of our work and how we measure it, and measuring our success and our outputs and stuff. And as higher ed becomes more and more corporatized, that becomes harder, I think. It was made me sad thinking about this one, because I think it's made it difficult for me to have a life outside of the classroom. I work, I'm working hard on not overworking in a sort of a normal sense, but I still find doing a quote unquote normal amount of work very exhausting. And so the end result is that I often don't have the energy for anything else. And so something I'm working on now is, especially as I approach tenure and all of its protections, is sort of thinking about, well, what would a sustainable work schedule look like for me, and allow me to have other things in my life and to be a whole human being. So that's been the biggest effect. And then another effect is more positive, is that it's gotten me, my disabilities have attracted me, I think, to working with rescue animals. So I volunteer with an organization that rescues parrots in central Illinois, and I've actually adopted some parrots as a result. And many of the birds that come through this rescue have been traumatized and abused, and many parrots in captivity, even if they haven't been abused, have a lot of mental illness. Mine certainly do. And I feel like there's a lot of compassion that we can give each other as a result of our shared experience of the world. A couple of years ago, sort of as I was coming out and trying to support people more actively, I realized just how hard it was to find other academics, whether they're grad students or faculty, even undergraduates and staff as well, who have disabilities or identify as disabled, because so many people are closeted. And so I started a subgroup of classics and social justice, which was itself forming at the time, that has now like sort of spun off into its own organization called Crip Antiquity. I coordinate this. It's a team effort of people working on various activism projects within ancient studies, and also community building and mentoring projects to try to provide more support for and advocacy for people with disabilities who have any sort of relationship to ancient studies, whether they're students, graduate students, faculty, whether they study the ancient world from outside of a university. If anybody wants to contact me, or they can go through our website too, cripantiquity.com, or the Twitter, those are all ways to get involved. We have a few different projects going on amassing pedagogy resources, lobbying conferences for greater accessibility. We're also working on establishing guidelines for graduate programs to address some of the issues we were talking about earlier. And Alicia Matz is going to speak about that, I think, at the conference. So you can talk to her directly as well. And then we're also really excited for people to propose their own projects, where they feel like there's a need, or even to get involved in something more, what's the right word? Just sort of a one-off, like organizing a meetup for a conference, or getting together online in some way. So those are all ways people can get involved. It's a hard one. I think finding mentors is the most important thing. Peer mentors, as well as people that are farther along in their academic careers. I think a mistake I made early on was I finally found somebody, a senior academic, who also had disabilities, but they were completely closeted and intended to remain so. And that really limited how I imagined my career could go. So I think finding a range of people who are living with their disabilities in a range of ways, like publicly to a range of degrees. Of course, some people, like, they're invisible, their disabilities are not invisible, right? It's not up to them whether to disclose. But I think especially if you have an invisible disability and you're struggling with to what degree to be public about it, it's really important to see models of different ways that can look, so that you can imagine yourself into one of them. And I think the other piece of advice I would say is just to know that as students, I think, already know, as undergraduates, academia is very ableist. And there's, I think, a lot of potential to overturn that structure, but it is really deeply baked in. And so I think that's something to seriously consider as you invest more of your life in the institution. Classics needs those students. Classics needs students with disabilities. Like, Classics needs those perspectives. People with disabilities have knowledge of the world and of being human in the world that other able-bodied and neurotypical people don't have. And that base of knowledge should be valued and uplifted. And it's so this isn't just a question of like justice and being fair to people, which is very important, but it's also about like the future of the field and who gets to make knowledge. I don't want anybody to put themselves at risk, right? But I also really hope that students will consider giving their talents to Classics, because we need them. Something you've spoken very eloquently about online is rethinking attendance policies, as well as technology policies, and in general how we assess participation and students' like bodily presence in the classroom. Also, many instructors, they want to make their classes accessible, but they really rely on disability services to set the terms of what that can look like. And in the US, we are allowed to, and this isn't the case everywhere, but in the US, we're allowed to extend accommodations to students even if they don't have a letter of accommodation. That's my understanding anyway. And so I think I would encourage instructors to both, invite students to use disability services and get them letters, but also encourage them to ask for accommodations even without that documentation, because documentation can be really hard to get. It's often students don't know what their disabilities are until they're midway through a class. And so encouraging that kind of more casual accommodation, I think, is really helpful. And in my experience, this is not a privilege that gets abused. Like, students, I've never so far had a student abuse this invitation. So I think it's really a worthwhile thing to do. And following that, giving examples in the syllabus of things, of accommodation, so that students can imagine different ways of getting through your class. So I list, for example, if you have depression, negotiating different deadlines. If you have chronic illness, coming to class less often, things like that. And that will, that means that instructors have to think clearly about what they are and aren't willing to support, right? But that's really good for students to know from the get-go also. And then also, I think building in reflective exercises throughout the semester, like especially around the midway point, to encourage students to think about their mental health and their overall well-being. This is something I started doing last semester, and there are a lot of students with disabilities, but there are a lot of students with mental illness in our classrooms, and that's definitely an upward trend. So I think building in that type of reflection and making it seem normal to assess one's mental wellness and to advertise supports can be really beneficial and also benefit the instructor, right? Like, that's a moment when we can take stock and think about, how can this class be more accessible to me too as an instructor? But I also think, like, this is something Crip Antiquity is working on, and if people have other ideas, we'd love to collaborate and crowdsource more best practices. People have very different preferences about how much, you ask, how are you doing, and things like that. And I think that's going to depend too on your personal relationship. That sort of issue, the interpersonal questions aside, the best thing that you can do to support your colleagues is to resist the culture of overwork and productivity in higher education. And that's not always, it's not always possible. People don't necessarily have the privilege or the status to truly criticize that system. But everybody can start to question the stories that we've been told and that we tell ourselves about what good academic work is, what counts as enough in an academic work day, what kind of pace we should be working at, and try to, as much as you're able and you feel safe doing so, try to slow it down and make space for people to really take care of their minds and their bodies, instead of, everyone feeling like they're on an assembly line. This is a metaphor that comes from people with queer sexualities. And I think most people are familiar with the metaphor, where it sort of both fits and doesn't fit with disabilities, because there are some disabilities that are visible or more apprehended by other people most of the time. Yeah. So like if you use a wheelchair, or if you are blind or low vision or have a support animal, like these are things that not everybody knows all of the time, but they're more or less always there. And then there are a lot of disabilities that are not. So a lot of mental illness and madness. On the one hand, madness is a term sometimes used by people in the disability community as a positive reclaimed term. So mental illness and madness, and then chronic illnesses like the ones that I have, which might manifest in the world in ways that people notice, but it isn't totally obvious to them what's going on. And so people who have those more hidden disabilities and illnesses are constantly trying to decide whether and how to talk about them to other people. And in a culture like academia that is very invested in productivity and work output on a certain schedule, it can feel really dangerous to admit that, for example, you need to take more time with something, or you have your disability requires special equipment that will cost someone money, that sort of thing. And I think this issue of disclosure it's a very complicated calculation, and I don't think it's anybody's responsibility to live their disabilities out in the open if they don't feel safe to. On the other hand, visibility makes a big difference to changing culture. Yeah. So I think it's something that we all have to think about. Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I think this is something I'm still educating myself about, but I do think it's a really important piece of the overall puzzle, that when students think about the ancient world, their world in general, right, disabled minds and bodies are not usually included. And when we think about the ancient world also as experts, that's often not at the forefront of our minds. And so the classroom is a great place to disrupt that picture. And actually, both texts and material culture offer us a lot of evidence for both the lived experience of disability, and then also that representation in art and in literature. So I think that once people start looking for those characters, disabled characters, experiences of mental illness, of neurodiversity, that they'll find lots of opportunities to talk to their students about it. A couple of challenges are, one is that there's a lot of overt prejudice and discrimination voiced by our ancient writers, and so that can be potentially quite upsetting in the classroom. And so it's something to prepare students for, I think. Yeah. And then the other issue is that when people were starting to try to represent gender and sexuality differently in classics classrooms, there was a tendency at that point to have like a day on women, or a day on enslavement. And that's definitely better than not addressing it at all. So I think if instructors feel like that's what they can do, then that's what they can do. But it's much better in general, I think, to build in all these inquiries into identity, have it be like a running thread through your course. So you might have a day when you like dive in and really talk about, well, like, what does disability even mean? Like, how is it constructed in the past and in the present? But really there are disabled characters all over our sources. So I think you can, address it as they come up, and don't feel like you have to be an expert in this subdiscipline. There are some good source books, but I think that the most important thing actually is for instructors to just read a little bit about disability as a socially constructed phenomenon and use that to try to problematize the way we think about the past. And I guess I do want to say one more thing, which is that I've really spoken from my perspective as somebody who did a PhD and then now has a tenure track job at a big research university. And I understand that's a very limited perspective, both in terms of higher ed and then also K through 12 environments are different in really interesting ways. And especially I think our voices is going to attract potentially a lot of K through 12 instructors. And so I'd be curious kind of how their own experiences differ from my own. Thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it. I wish I could be there. She came home with us just a few weeks ago, so she's still settling in. And you can see she picks a lot of her feathers out. So that's quite typical with birds in captivity. They get very anxious. Yeah. But she fits right in. So
I love her.
Thank you for hearing me.
So we're going to move on to the workshop portion for
10-ish minutes.
So we don't have very long, but for the workshop, please use the mic. Is this the mic we have?
Yeah, so if people are able to come up, we don't have a portable mic in this room, so if people are able to walk up or write your question and hand it to someone maybe who can, so that everyone is able to hear.
Yeah. So here are some guidelines, and I'll read them real fast. Be respectful, use your common sense, think before you speak. Don't try to insult other people. Be aware of the time and culture of the material we're talking about. So if we're talking about modern times, have that in mind. If we're talking about disability in the ancient world, with that context as we explained, don't speak over others, actively listen and engage with what's being said, and don't make assumptions about what others have experienced or what they know about this material. And take a break when you need to. So here are just some questions I put on to get us thinking, but if any of you have questions, come up. Yeah, do you wanna?
Is this good?
Yeah.
All right, hey guys, I'm Phoebe. I'm disabled. I actually have had a discussion question for you guys and also for anyone in the room. Make sure this. Basically, and I think this speaks to kind of transparency and communication and also the difficulty of accommodations, is I'm wondering, to say, even with kind of creating a trusting and communicative environment for your own students, is there a way that, or have any of us found ways to teach students also how to use the specific language that looks better in an email or more formal language to request accommodation or to communicate both transparently but also kind of strategically with maybe less sympathetic or less understanding educators or people of authority?
Okay. My very simple answer for that is I haven't had that experience yet. So
I've sort of had to learn on the fly. In my program at Bryn Mawr, for context, I'm no longer a classics student. I am a history student, and there are several things that go into that. But when I was a part of the classics program, there was a specific student who had some type of problem with me, and I still don't know what it is to this day, but it manifested in her lashing out in the classroom at me and yelling at me. And as someone who doesn't deal well with that for mental health reasons, that didn't work. But by the nature of the program and the size of our discipline, I was repeatedly forced to be in this type of environment with her and have to repeatedly go to professors and go to advisors to warn them about what's happening, because it would dramatically impact my ability to function in class. I don't have any strategies that work. That being said, our advisor at the time refused to help. I had to go through administrative paths
it's really a case-by-case basis, and it's hard to come up against those things, and there's no real structure I found in those situations, and it's never become easier. And for me, the most healthy thing was to take myself out of that situation.
Want to come up?
Yeah. So this is in response to the question. So I worked in student affairs and academic advising for like 4 or 5 years. And one thing I did for my students who had things like whether they were dealing with disabilities or maybe just with conflict in the classrooms as well, and specifically with instructors who weren't being accommodating to those requirements, is I told them, feel free to copy me in on your emails. And then I worked with them on developing that email. That way they knew they had someone who would be able to not only know what it said, but then support them and back them with that. That was a part of that. So I know that there are places where that's not, where maybe you don't have that sort of support, but maybe if you're teaching on campus, you can be that person. If you're in a department, you can help people find those kinds of people. And then maybe be a part of helping develop a culture that actually allows for that kind of support. Because I found that when students felt that they had someone who had their back when they were pushing for these things, they were much more willing to sort of ask for it and put it out there and step into it. So I think that's maybe a helpful way of supporting that.
I'm a newish faculty member, and I've told students they can use me as an, like Professor Pistone said, I can do X, Y, and Z to help. I was wondering if I can do that in this class, as an alternate way of meeting the assignment, meeting learning objectives. And I help them with the phrasing of, Professor Pistone helped me craft an alternate assignment that would meet the learning objectives for this course, or for her course. Could I possibly do the same thing in your course, where that puts a little bit more, like, if you have the security to make yourself that first lane, I think that has been helpful, something that they're trying to do more. So.
I just want to thank you both again for this talk. But I also wanted to open up discussing those teachers and not just what the students can do, but as someone who's looking to be a professor, I want to make sure I'm also holding my colleagues accountable. And I've definitely heard from different professors of like, oh, I just don't want to teach students like that, or students who have these problems, or students of these genders, or students of these races, which is always unfortunate, but it is a reality that has to be dealt with. And so I'm wondering, should we be pushing more for like transparency with like, especially among professors and those highest empowered, like what exactly they want to do and like what they're willing to put action towards. Otherwise I worry like things might get too lost like in those elite spaces with like, oh, the rhetoric of it all.
So I will say I have had to deal with professors like that, and one was in a role that was very close to my researching, and eventually I had to report him to my dean. I had to report him to the dean of students. I had to discuss it with the head of classics at the other school and make sure that everyone knew what was going on, so that I wasn't the only one who had to deal with his interesting beliefs. Yeah, I was trying to. And at first I tried to teach him like, oh, disabled people aren't stupid. Like we just do things differently. Or, oh, Black people are smart. We can learn ancient Greek. It's okay. Oh, Spanish it's a language. It can be an academic language. Like you should cite Latinx scholars. Our names aren't too confusing. But that didn't, yeah. I have stories. But that didn't really get through to him because he would just say like, oh yeah, of course, like social justice, woo, and be very performative. And still do these things that harm students, like further than just me.
much further than just me. So I did go around him and talk to other people about him to ensure that once I left that community, which I did, there would be accountability and someone to keep an eye on him. Yeah.
Continuing on that, as someone who's still in that area, there are no consequences that have been taken by anyone in regards to this situation, having been part of it myself. On the flip side, like a good example, my history advisor is generally much more aware of things, and was in a situation last spring where he was co-teaching a class with a professor who was acting very inappropriately toward all students, and him being there to monitor the situation during class time, to make it clear, reaching out to students individually to make sure that they were feeling safe, and making sure that they had a professorial advocate if anything got out of hand, which thankfully it didn't. And that the other professor is now retired, but he is known in the department as being an advocate not only for students, but also junior faculty who are not tenured. And because he is a tenured faculty member, he does have a relative air of safety, which is, there are other bureaucratic things that came into it. He's banned from some search committees now for having an opinion. But he's always been there to support students, always. And that's something that that's been sort of something that's been very important to me as a student with issues in classrooms and outside of them.
We're about out of time. If I can make this quick. So it's lunchtime. If anyone is an undergraduate who would like to speak in the main room where we did the welcome stuff, any undergraduates, we're planning to do sort of a roundtable fishbowl style thing for any undergraduates or high school students who are here. We would love to have everybody there. If you want to go grab some lunch and come back and prepare it, please do that. And if you would like to hear more, Wynter will be speaking on the keynote panel this evening. So if you would like to hear more of what they have to say, please do that then. Otherwise, I hope you are, if people can catch you both, and if you have questions, they're both wonderful people and we would love to talk to you more. And let's go have lunch. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, just a quick announcement. So if you left your coat in the room up next to registration, this gentleman who has a class there at 12:10, so you just need to